So in the rumor mill is a GTX 1070 Ti, and it's pretty much going to be announced this week after we've had leaks by Asus, Zotac, and EVGA. It pretty much confirms that a GTX 1070 Ti is coming. Now, the reason why this card exists is because when you take an AMD Vega 56 and you undervolt it and then flash the Vega 64 BIOS onto it, it actually performs a lot better than the GTX 1070. So Nvidia is then going to release the 1070 Ti as a response to the Vega 56 card and as a bridge between the 1070 and the 1080. Now, the specs for the 1070 Ti is basically a GTX 1070, but it has 2,432 CUDA cores instead of the regular 1,920 CUDA cores. And on top of that, it also features regular GDDR5 memory like the normal 1070. So you're not going to get G5X memory in this card. So in the end, that should put it in between the 1070 and the 1080, obviously. So earlier in the week, we had some leaked performance benchmarks of the 1070 Ti at a clock speed of 1,886 MHz, which appears to show overclocking, and the benchmarks were 3D Mark Time Spy and Firestrike Extreme. Now, the reason why I'm emphasizing the clock speed and overclocking is because apparently, according to rumors, there was going to be a locked clock speed for the 1070 Ti and that you wouldn't be able to overclock it. So, just based off these rumors, I'm not sure what's true. Maybe some cards are overclockable and others aren't. We won't know until the graphics card is announced later this week, but I suspect that overclocking will still be there just based off the clock speed that we've seen in these benchmarks. So I went ahead and got my GTX 1080, which has more CUDA cores than the 1070. I downclocked it to the same compute power as the 1070 Ti at 1880 MHz. And if you want to know how to do that, I have a video called How to Downclock Your Pascal Video Card, and you can watch that by clicking in the top right hand corner right now. But anyway, I underclocked that and I underclocked the memory, and I made the memory the same bandwidth and speed as the 1070 Ti's supposed specifications, and I ran some benchmarks. Now, do note, these are of course simulated benchmarks of a 1070 Ti, so they won't be 100% accurate or representative of a real 1070 Ti, hence why it's simulated. But since they are the same architecture, it should be very, very close, and the amount of CUDA cores is so slim between the GTX 1080 and the 1070 Ti. The 1080 has 2,560 CUDA cores, the 1070 Ti will have 2,432 CUDA cores. Now, based off this, any number of variables could also affect the results, such as my driver version. The driver version in 1070 Ti reviews might be newer. The CPU that I'm using a 7700K. The memory configuration that I have 16 gigabytes of DDR4 at 3200 megahertz. The fact that this is GDDR5X in my GTX 1080 and not GDDR5 memory, which will come in the 1070 Ti. The amount of CUDA cores that I have, the clock speed that I'm running at, the fact that it's simulated, the silicon quality, and the games that I benchmark, what scene I'm benchmarking, etc, etc. So don't bitch about that in the comments, but overall this should show similar results to if I was to test a real 1070 Ti, but again, anything could affect these results, and this is just more of a fun little experiment to do. And if I get a 1070 Ti in, I'll do the exact same sort of benchmarks, and we'll see how close I came to the real thing. Now, these short benchmarks include Battlefield 1, GTA 5, Time Spy, Firestrike Extreme, and that's it. So let's get started. So first up is Battlefield 1, which showed a decent performance gap, with the GTX 1080 hitting 167 FPS on average, and the simulated 1070 Ti hitting 145 FPS on average. Overall, this led to a 13% gap in performance, and that allowed the GTX 1080 to, of course, take the performance lead. Next up is GTA 5, which showed a much more decreased performance gap. However, the 1% and 0.1% lows show that indeed more memory bandwidth can lead to smoother gameplay, and that's what ends up happening. The GTX 1080 scored a respectable 103 FPS average, with the simulated Ti hitting 98 FPS on average, so not too large of a gap. Overall, this led to a 4.8% difference in performance, with the GTX 1080 coming out ahead. I suspect though that a real 1070 Ti will create a larger gap, but I'm just speculating. Then we had 3D Mark Time Spy, which put way more pressure on the memory, showing a 13% performance advantage for the GTX 1080 over the simulated Ti, with 3D Mark Firestrike showing similar results with a 15% performance advantage for the GTX 1080. Overall, when averaged out across the 4 benchmarks, the simulated Ti was a total of around 11.7% slower than the regular GTX 1080. Now, these are simulated benchmarks, so I expect with the real card, the gap will be a lot bigger, but again, that's just speculation until I get the thing in at my own house. Now, these are only 4 benchmarks on top of that, so it probably won't reflect the overall trend. I'm the type of guy who thinks that more benchmarks is always better, but I just don't have the time to do that right now. So when the 1070 Ti comes out, look for a benchmark or a reviewer who does a whole bunch of benchmarks, maybe like 20 or 30 games. I know that's kind of impossible to get, but Hardware Unboxed does do those kind of benchmarks, and he's really good at that, so I expect you should check out his channel. And I do suspect that the 1070 Ti, in most cases, will be around about 10 to 15% of the performance of the GTX 1080, around that, in terms of a gap. But, anything could happen. You could see, 5% like we saw in GTA 5. It just depends on how the engines work. Anyway, leave a comment below telling me what you think of a 1070 Ti. Also, like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video. This is Karma for Voltec, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.